Yep. Well, my doctor is here in case. Yep. In case I fall out.
Okay,
And
that's always good.
that's right. The judge that and say I don't even know why he's here because he got sick of hearing me talk in 1998.
He's checking to see if you made any progress.
That's right. That's probably it.
But anyway, Geoffrey knows what he's doing. He's a Beaufort boy, and he's got friends here among us. So I'm very eager to hear the rest of the story.
All right. How y'all doing?
Good.
Good. Thank you for coming on a day when it would be great to be out catching trout or doing something other than sitting here listening to me. I think that this is an important thing, and I'll be honest with you, I was a prosecutor here for over 20 years in this district, and I did not know about this. I retired not knowing about this. It wasn't until I started doing research on Beaufort's history that I found out about it. And I'm kin to one of the participants in it. So, I mean, this was something I just never had read about, and I stumbled on it.
Hey, what's your passcode?
Oh, my passcode. Oh, okay, sure.
Just tell me, because I only have to.
Let's see. I got it. No. Now, see, you've asked me about it, and I've missed a. Let's see. Nope. Well, what in the world? We might not get to see this. Just kidding. It got to use. Had to use a motor memory, not brain memory. 1978899.
19789.
Yeah, that's actually my bar number. So, all right, okay, all right. I found out about it when I was researching something else and stumbled on the very end of this story that happened not in 1899, but happened in 1935, and we'll get to that at the very end and see. How many people, just out of curiosity, how many people live in Carteret County? Are all of you Carteret County people? Yeah. How many people have ever heard of the lynching that occurred in 1899? Ron, you've heard about it? Yeah.
I just always heard about the hanging.
Well, that's right. There was every time I went to do any research, people say, "Yeah, wasn't he the guy that got hung on the courthouse square?" Well, the answer to that is no. That doesn't have any. In fact, I can't verify that. That is a legend that I can't tell if it really happened or not. There was also supposedly a lynching that occurred in Harlow right after the Civil War, but I can't find an accurate date. I can't find names. I can't find what it was about. I can't, and there's even different places where you read one thing, and what you find out when you start reading about it is that all of the sources are parroting each other. I mean, you know what I'm saying? That's right, exactly. So I can't tell you there wasn't other lynchings in Carteret County, but I can tell you this is the only one that's documented that I know actually happened. And so, by the way, everybody thinks lynching is hanging. It isn't. Lynching is any kind of extrajudicial killing that occurs, without due process of law. And so.
Excuse me, and if you would speak louder, we got some people out in the hall too. So.
Yep, 2 more seats.
Yeah.
Would you like to sit inside? There's a seat in there.
I'm almost at maximum volume here, so I don't know.
That's good.
Okay.
All right, the microphone is recording, not amplifying.
I know. Okay, all right. So lynching, most people think that you got to hang somebody to lynch them, but that isn't true. Anytime that you perceive yourself as being the law and go and take somebody and then take their lives, regardless of the method that you use, you can shoot them, run them over with a tractor, whatever you go. I mean, that's a lynching. And so it doesn't have anything to do with hanging on the courthouse square or any of that. So. I didn't know about this either until I started off looking for something else and then found it. The other thing I want to tell you up front is I told you that it's very well documented, and it is. They had invented telegraphs in those days in 1899. And so as soon as this started, the murder itself actually was the first thing that hit the newspapers. As soon as it started, upstate newspapers sent reporters down here to Beaufort and Morehead City and camped them in the hotels, the Atlantic Hotel that was over here where the port is now, roughly, and the Inlet Inn in Beaufort. And these reporters were telegraphing reports of what was happening real time almost into the newspapers, and they were appearing in the next morning edition. And there is a ton of information in the News and Observer, in the newspapers, 2 of them in New Bern, in the newspaper in Goldsboro, and I forget the names of these newspapers, but they all were running articles. And some of them were, it's kind of like the AP, some of them were running abbreviated articles that they had seen posted somewhere else. But a lot of them had their, especially in the News Observer, they had 2 reporters down here reporting this whole thing as it transpired. So there's a lot of information about it. And in spite of that, I have yet to find anybody in Beaufort that knows about it, and I didn't. And so it's the darndest thing. Come to find out, the jailer, and I'll just go ahead and tell you this up front, the jailer was my first cousin, thrice removed. His name was Bun Conkleton, and I'll show you a picture of his son. So anyhow, all right. So let's start by telling you a little bit of background, not about my research, but what happened immediately before this happened. How many know that there was an insurrection in Wilmington in 1898? Okay, you do know about that. All right. That happened in Wilmington almost exactly 8 months before this happened in Bogue, North Carolina. And Bogue, North Carolina is only about 50 miles or so from Wilmington. I can't tell you that that had anything to do with it, but I can tell you that was sort of the climate Eastern North Carolina was in at that time in 1899. There was a white supremacist movement that was open, and they basically said that we're going to take back the local governments from what was called the Fusion Party in those days, which was a sort of a conglomeration of white liberals and black people. You understand that Reconstruction had just ended not long before this, and black people had the right to vote, and they were clamoring to get to the polls. I mean, they were trying very hard to make themselves known, and there was a backlash of white supremacists. They actually formed, the supremacists did, some paramilitary organizations that were called the Red Shirts, and the Red Shirts terrorized communities here in Eastern North Carolina. The Klan had been suppressed by the federal government. It was still sort of underground in existence, but it had been suppressed to a great deal. But these Red Shirts sprung up and were sort of doing the dirty work for the supremacists, and they flocked to New Bern. The insurrection in New Bern occurred on November the 10th, about a week or so after the election that had elected this fusionist government of Wilmington, and they destroyed as much property of black people as they could. They ran all the fusionists out of town, and they killed somewhere between, the low estimate is 60 people, and the high estimate is 300 people in that insurrection. It was very, very bloody. I can't find where anybody was ever prosecuted for that. And so even though it was broad daylight when it happened right downtown in New Bern, they burned a black newspaper down there called the Daily Record. And I mean, it was, yes?
You said New Bern.
Oh, I said, yeah, I'm sorry, Wilmington, yes. Thank you for correcting me. Yes, in Wilmington. And so it was quite a time. Switch if you would, please. And again, this is actually, one more time, those are the Red Shirts. That's the kind of, I mean, they actually wore odd looking red shirts, and obviously not color photograph, but that's the Red Shirts that were in Wilmington. That is an actual photograph of that was taken contemporaneously with the insurrection. Dr. Wilkins, one more. And this is the ruins of one of Eastern North Carolina's only black newspapers at that time. It was the Daily Record, and burned it down. There's a film that was produced down there that comes on PBS from time to time that documents this whole thing, I think, fairly accurately. If you ever get a chance to see it, I highly recommend it. Dr. Wilkins? Now, in Bogue, 8 months later, one more time. In Bogue, there we go. How many people, I guess probably all of you know where Bogue is. It's down here, near Pelletier, right across the White Oak River from Swansboro, basically.
Just a nice sign.
Yeah. And there's some other places that you sort of need to be familiar with for this story. Obviously, Beaufort is one of them, but also up Newbern. So that's sort of that, and Havelock and Newport too played a part. So that sort of triangle right there is where all of the story takes place. In Bogue, in the spring of 1899, this is sort of the way it looked. That actually is a picture that was taken an area. I mean, first thing Jeff, they didn't have airplanes in 1899, and you're absolutely right. This is a 1939 aerial photograph, but things like in Beaufort didn't change much. And this is the way Bogue looked in 1899. It was very, very rural and very, very sparsely populated. These little dots here are hard to, that's actually houses or farm, and most of this is farm fields. That's January the 6th. So everything was probably fallow at that time. Taylor's Bay is, and that's the way it looks now. Taylor's Bay, Sanders Point, Goose Creek, that's what you're looking at. Nowadays, this is the same photograph, roughly, but it's got the air station on it, and it's very densely populated along the shorelines and such. The reason why I'm showing you this is most of what happened in this story down in Bogue was bulldozed when they built the air station. So trying to find pictures of the houses and the places that I'm going to talk about was impossible. They're all gone. So, okay. Bogue, even then, was a farming community where they raised watermelons and put them on an old boat via mule cart and shipped them here and there and yon. And mullet fishing was the other big industry that they had there, but it was basically farming and fishing. And that's what they did. It was a very tight-knit, if not cliquish, village in Bogue. All right, one more. In April or May of '99, a man showed up. His name was Lewis Patrick, and nobody knew anything about him. Everybody in Bogue knew each other, but this man just showed up. There were stories that were rumored that he had come from Beaufort and that he had actually worked in the fields of Murray Thomas, who was a planter that lived in Beaufort in that time. His progeny is still in Beaufort. I mean, was the sheriff. Two sheriffs actually were his grandson and great-grandson, I think I'm right. So, but this guy just showed up and nobody knew a lot about him, and to make matters worse, he spoke with a Geechee accent. Who knows what a Geechee accent is? Yeah, down on the sea, what they call the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia. It's a very African accent, you know, that's been preserved, much like our down east accent has been preserved. And so he spoke with that accent so thickly that, you know, that was the first thing people noticed about him. The other thing they noticed was he was a big man for that era. He was a muscular, quiet, almost sullen, tall man. And so he was very noticeable when he walked around. He stayed with a guy named Frank Stiles, who was a black man who lived in Ocean, which is just up the road from Bogue. He boarded with them, so to speak, and he would do odd jobs for not only Frank Stiles, but also for other people. And that's how he sort of kept himself fed. But he would, I mean, he wasn't somebody that people became friends with. He was very quiet. Dr. Wilkins? And that's the Geechee people that I was telling you about. They still, in those days, they wove baskets prolifically and still do. Okay, there's the Sea Islands where this Lewis Patrick probably was from. Okay, one more. There was also a couple of stores in Bogue, but the most popular one was the Weeks store, country store. This is not it. If you drive back and forth on Highway 101, you recognize that one. That's a store that's in Harlow that's now in terrible disrepair. But the reason why I use that to illustrate is, first of all, the real store was demolished when they built the air station. And the other thing is there are descriptions of the Weeks store, and it looks just like this. And so, and you're going to find that I'm sort of being creative in this, because there aren't pictures of lynchings usually. I mean, sometimes you get pictures of after the lynching, but the lynchers don't carry cameras and document their stuff, and so obviously so. But this was what the Weeks store looked like. You know, inside it was your typical store where people could buy everything from 9 cigars for 25 cents to having their coffee ground to soap to everything else. But the thing about it is Mr. Elijah Weeks, who ran and owned that store, was a very, very popular man for a lot of different reasons. First of all, it was where everybody gathered to gossip and drink coffee and smoke cigars, obviously, and do whatever else, talk about the farm, whatever. And the other thing about him was that he was a changed the picture. There we go. He was, and this isn't him, but this is what in my mind's eye, because I read this description after description of it. He was a smallish man, but he was plagued badly with rheumatoid arthritis, to the point that there were days that he could not get out of bed, and other days he was more or less okay. He had never married. He didn't have any children. He had a twin brother that had just died in the spring before this happened. That twin brother was married, but his wife died also. So their children was sort of in the care of Mr. Weeks. In fact, he was going to sell his store. He had plans to sell his store and move over to Pelletier and open another store, which is where the children were. That way the children could take care of him on his bad days, and he could take care of them financially. It was, sort of a thing that was made in heaven. But that was Mr. Weeks, a very popular man. Everybody loved him. He slept upstairs in this store. He had a bedroom up there that he would go upstairs and sleep. He didn't apparently like to cook or didn't know how to cook, so he boarded with a lady by the name of Miss Taylor that was about a quarter of a mile up the road on the old Newport Highway. And he would come every day and get breakfast at the same time. And at night he would eat his supper there. And then he'd go on back to his store and he'd lock everything up and go upstairs and go to bed. So, change. Thursday, June 8th, 1899. The breakfast table at the boarding house was empty. And he was a punctual man. The only reason why he wouldn't come get breakfast was if he was having a spell of this arthritis. And so he never came. Hour went by, and Miss Taylor said, "Leon," who was her 18-year-old son, "go over there and see where Mr. Weeks is. He might be down with the arthritis." So Leon goes over to the store and peers in the window. Store is dark, it's locked, he can't get in. It's already way past time that the store should have been open. He can't find anybody there. Of course, that little kid there was one of my inventions. But pretend like he's 18. He's just right. So we're right there. So he goes back home and says, "Mom, I don't know. His place is locked up and it's dark inside, from what I can see." He said, "All right, well, we'll wait just a little bit longer." So a little bit longer comes, and he still no Mr. Weeks. And so sends Leon back over again. This time Leon walks around to the front and notices that the shutters on the front of the store are held together by a rag that has been stuffed in between the shutters. So he pulls the rag and the shutters spring open. Then he can look into the store and see that it's been ransacked. Things are laying on the floor, shelves have been toppled over. He knows that Mr. Weeks would never let that be. So he runs as hard as he can. He's going back home, but he passes his older brother and another man working on a house and re-roofing a house. And so he tells his older brother, "Come with me." Mr. Weeks is in trouble, so they climb down the ladder, the other man and the older brother and Leon, the three of them go and to the same window, and they notice that the window's actually open. So they open the window up. When I say open, it's not locked. They open the window up and they crawl into the window. Everything's ransacked, everything's eerie quiet. And so they go upstairs, and this is what they see. They see Mr. Weeks in his night clothes, laying, well, he's not really laying, he's on his knees, laying over the bed, and his head has been wrapped in a sheet. And when they take the sheet down, there is a plow rope, which is what you steered the mule with. There's a plow rope wrapped around his neck, and there are great big bruise marks on his neck too. He's been garroted and he has been strangled, and he's dead. So they run and they get the only law enforcement in those days that's down there. It's a doctor, believe it or not, a doctor by the name of J.W. Sanders. And the Sanders people still live down there. So if you're a Sanders from Bogue, I'm gonna talk nasty about your man, but but that's the way things are. So the law enforcement is a justice of the peace, a doctor named J.W. Sanders. He immediately comes to the scene and takes over the scene of the crime. Now, nowadays there would be police everywhere. There's all kinds of police agencies that we have nowadays. But in those days, the only real police other than the justice of the peace was in Beaufort, the sheriff's department, which was a long haul, it's 25 miles. And so there wasn't any Bogue police department or anything. And so the only police that had jurisdiction was the sheriff. His name was Alvin Willis from Morehead City at the time. And so this crime scene is taken over by J.W. Sanders, Dr. J.W. Sanders. Let me tell you a little bit more about him. He had a brother who was a Confederate officer. I think that J.W. Sanders might have been a little bit old to serve in the war. I'm not positive. But I can't find whether he was actually in the Confederacy or not, but his brother was. He's a farmer. He's got a big farm, and he loves raising different kinds of animals and such, and having them in shows at the state fair or wherever else. He's a doctor with a booming practice because he's the only doctor around down in there. He's got a booming, and apparently a fairly competent doctor too. I mean, it's not just some quack. He's got a medical degree from a real college. I don't know if it was UNC or not, but he got one. And I mean, he's a real doctor. He's got a store also. Not only is he the justice of the peace, but later in his life, he ran for the legislature and became one of the representatives from our district, including Beaufort. So he was quite a character. Also, he liked to boat. And he had a nice, big, it was described as a nice, big Sharpie by the name of Katie Doe. The K-A-T-I-E-D-O-E, Katie Doe. That's going to be important in a minute. So they find Mr. Weeks. Dr. Sanders has taken over the crime scene. They find these great big footprints under the window. And Dr. Weeks says, I know who made those footprints. That's that guy that showed up in town here. He's the biggest person in town, and these are the biggest footprints I've seen, so 2 and 2 together. So they hire some constables. And I don't even know what a constable was in those days, or what. I mean, I don't know if it's just somebody you say you're a constable, and that, I don't know. But I do know that these guys must have been pretty good darn deer hunters, because they tracked those tracks, honest to God, to Newport, North Carolina, and lost the trail outside of Newport. And then they said, well, where would he be going? Would he be going to Beaufort? Or no, because he probably is known there. I'll bet he's going to Newbern. Let's go to Havelock and see if he got on the train, which was a dang good assumption, because, switch the thing if you would please. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you this. This is where it first hits the newspaper. Okay, that's the Star Telegram, which I think is Goldsboro. I'm not sure, or maybe Newbern, I can't remember. But the murder itself actually hit the news before they had arrested anybody for it. So, and it describes pretty much exactly like it happened. So, I mean, this is like, to me, it was like the first of modern journalism, where reporters are filing stuff almost in real time. I'm right in your way, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're okay.
Okay. Well, hold on a second. There we go. Everybody read that as much as they want to? Okay. Well, yes, they actually had 2 or 3 that they were concerned about. And the reason why is because one of the other suspects, who turned out not to be he was exonerated, had actually broken into the store 6 months before and stolen some money. So they figured, well, if he did it once, maybe he did it again. So, but it turned out he had an alibi. So, okay, all right. This is actually poor old Mr. Weeks' final resting spot in the Methodist Cemetery in Bogue. It's right off of Bogue Loop Road, just as it's at the west end of Bogue Loop Road. And if you go into the cemetery, you can find the Weeks plot. It's a great big plot, and there is his tombstone. It's been broken, but I don't think that was vandalism. It was just probably toppled over and broke or what have you. But as you can see, he died on June the 7th. We don't really know if he died on June the 7th or June the 8th, but during the night of June the 7th. But that's Mr. Weeks' cemetery plot. Okay? Now, they went immediately after looking at these big footprints, looking for the big guy, Lewis Patrick. And they first went to Ocean and talked to Frank Stiles. Frank, we're looking for your boarder, this big guy, Lewis Patrick, is that his name? Frank said, yeah, that's his name, but I haven't seen him in a while. He didn't spend the night here last night. He wasn't here for breakfast. I hadn't seen him since maybe the day before yesterday or yesterday. And so now J.W. Sanders, Dr. J.W. Sanders, he knows he's got what he wants. So he hires these constables, and they track the tracks all the way up to Newport, lose the trail in a swampy area, decide, let's go to Havelock and see about that. So they ride on up or walk, or ride, I think, on up to Havelock, which in those days was a train station. Havelock was just basically a train station on the tracks, and that's it. And so they asked the attendant of the train station, have you seen a big black guy, a great big black guy? And he speaks with a Geechee accent. Absolutely. He was just here a couple hours before. He bought a ticket to get on a train to go to New Bern. And so they hop on the horses and gallop up to New Bern and start looking around the waterfront of New Bern. And lo and behold, guess who's sitting on a bench at Union Point in New Bern waiting to get on a steamer? It is Lewis Patrick. Change, please, sir. There is 1907's New Bern waterfront, and you see a steamer. I'll talk a little bit about all of this in just a second. I think that's a Bayard Wooten photograph made into an, anyhow, she was from New Bern, obviously. Okay, switch again. This is an actual photograph of the steamer that Lewis Patrick was waiting to get on. It is the SS Neuse, steamship Neuse. And it's docked at one of its ports of call. In those days, there was a very active steamboat trade on the North Carolina Sounds. Albemarle Sound, Pamlico Sound, and the larger rivers. These steamboats would carry passengers and cargo back and forth, leaving literally every day. I mean, you could, and what this boat was going to do was going to pick up passengers in New Bern, and it was going to go to Elizabeth City. So he was trying to get on a steamer to go to Elizabeth City, and they found him. Now, these constables had enough sense that they didn't try to go and snatch him up themselves. They contacted the sheriff of Craven County. Sheriff of Craven County and 2 deputies came down there, change the picture, please, sir, and nabbed him right up. Now, this is not Lewis Patrick, and that's not the Craven County deputies. Again, that is the steamer Neuse, but I've sort of put this all together in my mind's eye. This is what it looked like. So, okay, am I totally in your way?
No.
You want me to move and be in Ben's way?
No.
All right. So they nabbed it, and apparently they had to keep him in custody for a while in New Bern because they planned to put him on a train to go back to Carteret County, which is where the crime occurred. So Carteret County had jurisdiction over this murder. They were going to try him, so they took him to the Carteret County jail. Okay? Switch the pictures. So a couple of days later, Saturday, June the 10th, they put him on a train. And this is an actual, well, that's not an actual photograph. This is the deputies carrying him down from the jail over to the train station. That's probably in Wyoming or something, but anyhow, let's go again. But that is the train. That is the Norfolk and Southern Railroad that ran between New Bern in those days and Morehead City. It ended at Morehead City. It didn't go all the way to Beaufort until 7 years later in 1906, when they built a trestle across the 2-mile marsh between Shepherd's Point and Broad Street in Beaufort. But in those days, it went to Morehead City. Now, somewhere along this line, the sheriff, both the Craven County Sheriff and Alvin Willis, got word that they were going to try to stop the train or else board it while it was stopped and lynch this black guy. That was the first rumors they heard of that. Didn't know who, didn't know what, this guy's going to get lynched. And so, but they put him on the train nonetheless. Switch the photo. And they went, or started, down the railroad tracks from New Bern all the way down to Beaufort. Now I put this in green because the tracks ended at Shepherd's Point, right down the road here, and you had to get onto a Sharpie. Who knows what a Sharpie is? Okay, Sharpie's a sailboat. It was kind of like the Carolina skiff of the day. I mean, you worked Sharpies, you had pleasure crafts as Sharpies, you took passengers on Sharpies. I mean, they had a lot of sail and a very shallow draft, had centerboards so that you could sail them in shallow water. But you had to, in those days, get on a Sharpie, and there was always a bunch of Sharpies with captains there waiting to take passengers over to Beaufort or to bring them back. And so that green portion is through the but through haystacks to get to Beaufort. And that's what they did. But they knew there was going to be a lynching attempt at Newport. And so they hid Lewis Patrick and I didn't know that trains had bathrooms in those days, but they did. And then I was told later on that the bathroom was simply a hole in a plank, and that was it. So yeah, there wasn't any holding tank or anything. So, but they hid Lewis Patrick in the bathroom, and when the train stopped at Newport, because that was a regular stop, it wasn't like they held guns on them or anything. Sure enough, there was a big crowd there, and but they looked into the train, and Lewis Patrick had been stowed in the bathroom, and they were satisfied when the sheriff said, "We took him down there." Sure enough, but we took him down there by boat. They said, "Yeah, that sounds like it's about right." So they left. 2 days later, in another newspaper, everybody in Newport had gotten together to deny this. They said, I don't know where this rumor came from, but we sure enough were down at the train station. We wanted to see the murderer being taken back, but we weren't going to kill him or anything. So that was, we did not try to, it was a very calm crowd, and we didn't try to lynch anybody. So who knows? 2 different reports. Okay, switch. It hit the papers though. Somehow somebody found out, and they reported it, and there was probably a little bit of drama here, maybe a little bit of, as my old boss David McFadden used to say, a little bit of VistaVision and Technicolor in this report. But yes, that was about the sheriff and the prisoner in the bathroom and all of that. And so, okay, switch again. Are y'all bored yet?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Now, this is the train station taken from almost here. I took this picture and put it in the set because this is about where we are right now looking east. That's the old Atlantic Hotel in the fog down there in the distance, and beyond that is a train, but that's where the tracks ended. And but as best I can tell, this platform was somewhere around where we are now, maybe a little bit further east on the tracks. Okay, that's where they would have arrived. They would have gotten on a Sharpie and gone over to Beaufort. The only other option was to get on the old, what they call the old Core Creek Road, and go all the way around over a bridge. They wouldn't have done that. Talk about endangerment of lynching. Okay, switch. And they took him to the jail. Now that is the Carteret County Jail in its original place. You women will be happy to know that that's the woman's jail portion of it. They actually segregated men and women, and the jailer and his family lived in the upstairs and the cells were downstairs. The jailer's wife cooked for her family and the inmates. And it was all a very cozy arrangement. The jailer, I think I told you, was David Bunn Conkleton. And David Bunn Conkleton was kin to me through my grandmother, a Whitehurst, and he was my first cousin, thrice removed. Some people call that fourth cousin, but that's not really right. It's first cousin, thrice removed. Okay, yeah, well, because you determine relationships by looking at the person through whom you go to be related. So a first cousin, you're actually related to the first cousin through your grandparents. See what I'm saying? Your first cousin has the same grandparents that you do. And then you go up the line that way and determine whether, and that's what thrice removed or twice removed or once removed means. Okay. I told you there'd be a damn place that I got to use that. All right, switch again. That's actually the jail cell. I can't guarantee that's where Lewis Patrick was kept in that particular cell, but that is a cell in the Carteret County Jail.
So clean.
Well, it was then, and it probably, to be all honest, you know, the jailer living there probably kept it fairly clean. I mean, okay, again. That's Bunn and his wife Sarah's quarters that were upstairs. So, I mean, it was fairly nice for the day. Yeah. That's where Lewis would have been. Now, because the sheriff had already heard rumblings of lynching, he put Lewis in a cell that had a ring in the floor. And he chained Lewis to the ring, and he kept the key. Now he's not trying to be mean to Lewis. He's because the chain lets Lewis walk around. He just doesn't want anybody to come in and take Lewis. So he actually changed the chains around his waist, and he's locked to the floor. But he's also in a cell. So that's where he would have been. Now they have completely redone the inside of the jail. So I don't know if that's, I don't know if they covered up the ring in the floor or what. But anyhow, that's the way it probably looked to Lewis. He had a haystack to sleep on, would put his head on in the corner, and that was about it. Okay, change, please. But in Bogue, things weren't going well. They were having community meetings in all the stores, and they didn't trust Carteret County to do the right thing with this criminal that had taken their beloved merchant, Elijah Weeks. They thought, well, Beaufort might as well be on the dark side of the damn moon. You know, we don't know if he's going to get prosecuted, or are they just going to let him fall through the cracks? Is he just going to go scot-free or what? And after all, there was this Bonner murder over in Pamlico County. Now I'm quoting some of the people right now. And that Bonner murder, before they could, I mean, everybody knew that guy was guilty. And before they could get him prosecuted, they just fell through the cracks and nothing ever happened. We're not going to let that happen. I have researched and researched and researched. I cannot find a Bonner murder where in Pamlico County where any of that happened. So anyhow, but they did have community meetings. And they talked about a lot of different things. Switch the please, sir. And one of the biggest talkers was that man right there. Now this is one of my pride findings. I found this J.W. Sanders photograph, and he's a big player in this. He's Dr. J.W. Sanders, not because that's a mugshot. That's because later on he was very wealthy. He was wealthy then. He gave money to a school in Swansboro that made the news, and by that time they had cameras that could take pictures that were printed in the newspapers. As you can see, I found it in a newspaper. But that's J.W. Sanders there. He kind of looks like how you going to get to know him. You know, he kind of looks like that. All right, switch if you would, please. J.W. Sanders also was a bit of a shyster. Yeah. He had a pill that you could take for anything, and it would cure you right up. Yep. And he sold them out of his store at the Sanders store down in Bogue. Found that in the newspaper and was absolutely stunned. But yeah, J.W. Sanders, not only did he farm and raise prize-winning animals, have a medical practice, but he also sold chill pills too. That's right. Okay, switch again if you would, please. But we also know that at least in 1887, J.W. Sanders had a nice, large Sharpie named the Katy Doe. That's where my source is on that. That was also, it's amazing. And then back in the day, newspapers didn't have a lot to print. And so if you went anywhere and did something, the newspaper would find out about it and print you up in the newspaper. Went all the way from Bogue to Swansboro. Okay, if you could switch again, please. That's what a Sharpie looks like. That's a family outing. I don't think that it's the Sanders family, but that's what a Sharpie looks like. I think his Sharpie was a single master too. They came both ways, single and two-masted Sharpies. Shallow draft, a lot of sail in the air, and so they would wisp along on the lightest wind. Okay, would please change. One of the things that concerned the citizens of Bogue the most was what was going to happen to the orphans. No kidding, I'm serious. There was a letter that was supposedly drafted by the oldest girl, that was the niece of Weeks, what was going to happen to her and her brothers, the nephews. And that letter was circulated around the community in Bogue, and everybody knew that these orphans now didn't know what was going to become of them. And they were so upset that Weeks had been murdered because he was sort of their last lifeline. And so that was one of the things. Okay, if we could switch again.
Maybe.
Okay. And now, I apologize up front. The reason why I became a lawyer was because of a movie called To Kill a Mockingbird. No kidding. You think I'm kidding, but that is my earliest memory of. Before that, I wanted to be an airplane pilot like my father, and something switched after I saw that movie. It came on the television maybe a year or two after it came out on something called Saturday Night at the Movies. Do y'all remember that? It used to come on one of the channels. Came on that, and my mom let me stay up and watch it to the end. And from that day on, I thought, I think that I'd like to do that. And so that is a scene out of To Kill a Mockingbird. That's the lynching scene where they're getting ready to lynch Tom Robinson. So, okay, switch please. And sure enough, on the 13th of June, after, remember, Patrick was incarcerated, they put masks on in Bogue, the men did. They put soot on their faces. They wore dark clothing. They carried whatever guns they owned, pickaxes, hatchets, all kinds of implements to break into the jail. And they got on a Sharpie. I can't guarantee it was the Katy Doe, but it was a Sharpie. And they started down the Sound, or actually up the Sound, in order to get to Beaufort sometime 10:30 or 11 o'clock. That's how they timed it. So they got onto their Sharpie, switch please, all dressed up with their paramilitary gear, and they started towards Beaufort. Switch again. And that's the route they took, down the Sound and into the west end of Beaufort. They would have gone, see, in those days there wasn't a bird show. There was a bird show, but it was a show. Yeah, it wasn't an island. So they could have maybe even come through the other way, but that's where they went. They went through Gallant's Channel and ended up on the west end of Ann Street. Okay, switch please. That's exactly where they ended up. Those are Sharpies that are parked at the west end of Ann Street. That complex of buildings over there on the left was a boatyard called the Rice Whitehurst Boatyard. That was at the end of Ann Street in those days. That conspicuously is the Duncan House. You know, I really ought to be using my little cat toy, hadn't I? Hadn't even thought about it. Thank you, sir. Yeah. Oops. That's the Duncan House. And that's the boatyard right there. And all those are Sharpies parked there. They came into Gallant's Channel and parked there at 10:30 at night, somewhere around the boatyard, and got out of their Sharpie and started marching up Ann Street towards Moore Street, towards the corner of Ann and Moore. Somewhere along the line, switch please. Somewhere along the,
Go back.
Okay, yes, sir. Happy.
Where was the Worcester County?
Right there also.
Okay.
Yeah, except it was, I think that they built the boatyard after it was, after it was torn down, the Oyster House. Now, the Oyster House, by the way, was the same building, but it had like 4 different names. It started off being the Duncan, and then it was the Enterprise Oyster Company, and I think Acme was another one, but that same building was operated by different companies, but it was right there absolutely on the end. I think maybe the Oyster Company, I don't know when it was torn down, but the boatyard was there right at the turn of the century. I do know that. Yeah. Okay. Again, there we go. That's Ann Street. Not long after this happened, that picture would have been taken probably in 1908 by Bayard Wooten. So, maybe 9 years after this happened. You're going right up Ann Street, and you're going to turn at the corner of Moore, which is right there at the left. But about right there, they ran into Beaufort's postmaster. He was a fellow by the name of George Wheatley. George Wheatley had closed the post office. In those days, the post office was at the corner of Front Street and Craven Street. It was in the old Potter building, the first Potter building. And so George had closed his post office, had done his bookkeeping. It was now about 10:30 at night. He was walking home. You got to understand, in Beaufort, there was no electricity in spite of these telephone poles here. There was no, in 1899, there was no electricity. It was dark, but he was making his way towards his home, and he ran head on with the lynch mob, right at the corner of Ann and Moore. They took him prisoner. It said, look, if you'll walk at the head of this parade, you're not going to be hurt. We're not here after you. He thought that they were, because he had run some people out of his post office about 2 days before, and he figured he was the victim in this, but they didn't care about him. They just didn't want him, running and hollering, here's a lynch mob. And you couldn't mistake them for anything else with their dark clothing, their guns, and their suited up faces. I mean, they were up to no good. So they capture him, put him up at the head of the line. He's marching along. Switch, please. And that is not a picture. That is a picture of another postmaster about the same time in North Carolina. So that's not George, but I bet he knew this guy. So I bet he did. All right, switch again. There they are with George at the head of the line, poor George. They're marching up Moore Street. They turn left, and George eyes this house right here, which is the James Davis house, which still exists. And he says, I am not going to trust them at their word. And in those days, there was actually shrubbery around, and it's dark as pitch. And so they're marching along, and all of a sudden, when he gets right abreast of the James Davis house, George bolts left and goes through the gate and disappears into the yopon bushes behind the house. They don't, okay, switch if you would please. That's the James Davis house today. I took that picture yesterday, in fact. So, okay, switch again. They don't pay any mind to George escaping. They've got more important matters, so they keep right on marching. They turn on Broad Street and go to the courthouse. That courthouse did not exist. That courthouse was built probably 1909. What, does anybody know exactly? 11. Okay, yeah. So that one didn't exist. Instead, if you'll switch, the courthouse was down there at the corner of Broad Street and Turner Street. And now it's not the old courthouse that's now on the historical grounds. There's actually been at least 4, maybe 5 courthouses in Beaufort. But that one right there was torn down, demolished. It was a brick courthouse that later got used as a schoolhouse. Okay. When they moved, what I did was I erased the courthouse that was right here, and I drew an arrow to that. It says schoolhouse, but that was the courthouse then when the new courthouse was built. But the jail was up here, and so they marched down Broad Street, maybe up Craven, or maybe they just went right across the courthouse square and went to the jail. Okay. Switch, please, if you would. And they got to the courthouse, and they knocked on the door. And this is in the middle of the night, probably 11:15. And they knocked on the door, and Bun's in there doing whatever Bun was doing. And he says, who is it? And this voice outside says, we got a prisoner. And Bunn hollers back through the closed door, well, you're going to have a warrant. We got one. Sheriff gave us one just now. So Bunn says, well, damn odd to have a prisoner at, a 11:15 at night, but okay. So he opens the door. And when he opens the door, he later said, I saw 100 people out there with guns pointed directly at me. Now, there wasn't 100, but if a bunch of people are out there pointing guns at you, you probably think so. So Bunn says, come on in, I know what you want. And so they came in, or at least some of them did, and switch, please. And that's not Bunn, but that is Bunn's oldest son. And I get the impression that he probably looks like Bunn. And those ears.
Is that
Yeah.
Alvin Company?
Pardon?
Is that Alvin Company?
William. Yeah. Now he died before I was born, a long time before I was born. Because William actually was not even in the jail when that happened because he was already like 21 or 22. So he would have moved out, maybe, but that's Bunn Conkleton's oldest son, William. Okay. Bunn sees them, come on in, I know what you want. So they walk in and there's Lewis Patrick in the cell downstairs. I mean, he knows what they want too, so he's crying and shaking and everything. And they say, give me the key to the cell. So Bunn says, well, I tell you what, I'll give you the key to the cell, but I haven't got that key to that chain. The sheriff's got it, and he's not here. So they said, don't worry about it. They opened the cell door. 2 of them have hacksaws that they brought with them, and they start hacksawing the chain in the floor. And the whole time, Lewis Patrick is crying and saying, just kill me now in my horror. He knows what they want. He's just shaking, and so they get through the hacksaw through the chain in probably 5 or 6 minutes, take him up, bind him, hands behind his back, and walk him out the door, and the door shuts. They walk the same route down the street towards the dock there at the end of Ann Street. In the meantime, Postmaster George has raised the hue and cry. And he has told everybody that he can find that's still up in Beaufort, we got a jailbreak going on. And so who he finds is 2 or 3 normal citizens and the mayor of Beaufort. Now this is where I'm getting a little confused. Change, please. That's Bunn's, by the way, that's Bunn's cemetery plot in the Episcopal Cemetery in Beaufort. Okay. Change again. And that's where they're grabbing Lewis Patrick. Yeah, it probably looked like that. Now this is an interesting thing that I ran across. Postmaster Wheatley has raised the hue and cry. People are going down to the dock following the lynch mob who have Lewis Patrick tied up, marching with them. One of the people was the mayor of the town, and this reporter identifies him as Mayor Hancock. And for a while, I thought, well, that's probably right. I don't know. So then, like my friend Steve Goodman, I'm just not going to satisfy with because a newspaper report says I'm going to get into town records and look. And that's what I did. I went, just like Steve does often, and went to the town records. Switch, if you would, please. And I found the real picture of the real mayor then, who was also a Conkleton. That was the real mayor in Beaufort. So I don't know what that report about it is. But one way or the other, if the mayor of Beaufort followed the lynch mob down there, and go back if you would please, Dr. Wilkins, and talked about, when is he going to have the fun? And the lyncher said, probably tomorrow. Okay, bye, y'all have a good trip, that kind of thing. If the mayor of Beaufort does that, switch again, and I don't know if it did. I don't know if that man or somebody else, but if the mayor did, as Judge can tell you, it triggers that right there. Now you see, in the law, if you lynch somebody, at least in those days, if you lynch somebody, white, black, pink, whatever, you've murdered them. And that's what you're charged with, is murder, kidnapping and murder, and whatever else we could think of. But there's no violation of the 14th Amendment unless somebody in the state helps you do it or does it themselves. Do you remember Rodney King? You remember that the police officers that were videoed hitting and kicking him and everything, they were tried and acquitted. Do you remember that? And then sometime later, the Fed says, well, we're going to try him for violating his 14th Amendment due process. And they convicted the officers for that. You remember that? Well, that's because this is triggered when police officers do stuff like that or other government officials do stuff like that. And if the mayor of Beaufort is down, and that it's not just state, it's any government that we're talking about. If the mayor's down there waving them goodbye, essentially, and not trying to, I can't guarantee that triggers it, but at least it's something that a good lawyer could talk about. Okay? Ratified in '68, right after the Civil War. So it applied. Absolutely applied. Now, again, I don't want to get any Hancocks in this room or any Concords in this room upset because I don't know that it happened. Again, some of that reporting was absolutely Vista Vision and Technicolor. I mean, I can tell you why in just a minute. Okay, switcher, if you would, please.
Geoffrey,
Yes, ma'am.
so did you, in your research, did you find anyone with the name of Hancock?
Negative.
Some kind of official? in
No, I did not. They might have been. The records are, you understand the town hall burned down in 1967. It used to be on Broad Street. Y'all remember that? Ron remembers it. Yeah. Yep, burned down, and so a lot of the records went with it. But anyhow, now, by this time, the sheriff is aware of things. The Sharpie has left with their prisoner. The crowd is dispersed. You know, there's a lot of talk in town. The sheriff, Alvin Willis, springs to action, and he is going to chase them. He forms a posse. They are armed also, and they use something called a naphtha launch. And I kept seeing that in the newspapers, and I'm wondering what in the heck is a naphtha launch? Well, a naphtha launch, come to find out, is a essentially gasoline-powered boat that really had not been invented very long before this all happened. But Beaufort apparently had one. I don't know if it belonged to the town or if he just borrowed it, but the sheriff got hold of this naphtha launch. The advantage of a naphtha launch was that the other option of having a powered boat was a steam engine. Well, to have a steamboat, you had to have a licensed engineer operate it. And you also had to have government inspections and everything. So this naphtha launch had a gasoline engine, which supposedly anybody could operate. And so the sheriff and his posse got on the naphtha launch and took out after the Sharpie. Sharpie, by the time this all happened, Sharpie had left sometime before, 2 or 3 hours maybe. All right? Twitch. And they chased the Sharpie. Again, you know, they didn't actually see the Sharpie. They would have caught it if they did, but go ahead. Switch again. One report said that the sheriff and his posse stopped at the Old Atlantic Hotel, which is right down the street here, thinking there was no way in the world they were going to leave and go back to Bogue, but it turns out that they did that. There was nobody in the Atlantic Hotel had seen anybody in a boat or anything else as they left and got back in the naphtha launch and took off down to Sound. Now, we come to two different stories in the newspaper. One is they caught the Sharpie. Got up close to it, and just as soon as they got close to it, everybody on the Sharpie opened fire against them. Actually, you know, shot at close range, shot at the people in the naphtha launch. Sheriff said, we're not going to go get ourselves killed over this. We're not going to get in a gun battle in the middle of Bogue Sound and kill a bunch of people over this, you know, and we're going to go back to Beaufort. That's one story. The other story is they didn't ever really catch the Sharpie, but instead the naphtha launch malfunctioned and they had to come back to Beaufort and repair it. One way or the other, they didn't catch the Sharpie, they had to come back to Beaufort. We do know that at daylight the next day, they got back into the repaired naphtha launch and took off towards Bogue again. Now, switch again. Wednesday, June the 14th. The Sharpie with the prisoner arrives at sunrise at one of the landings in Bogue. People who are at the landing see all of these men still smeared up with soot and everything, get off of the Sharpie, take this black guy, Lewis Patrick, into the woods. Okay, they see that. Not long after that, some people say as early as 30 minutes later, the sheriff arrives in Bogue. But by that time, everybody in the Sharpie's gone. Switch, please.
The sheriff from
Beaufort.
Bogue.
Alvin Harris gets there in the Napa launch with his posse.
How many men or people were on that launch, the Napa launch?
I like to think my great-grandfather was.
But I mean, like 5 people? Or like,
Well, he was a fire person.
okay.
Yeah.
So you think a handful? Like,
Yeah, I don't know how many or who they were or anything. I would love to know. The reason why I think Dory would have been is that Dory lived directly across Turner Street from the courthouse and the jail and the sheriff. Dory was such a fireman, that when he got killed later on, when a tombstone fell on him, they had a funeral for him, and he rode to the graveyard on the back of Beaufort's fire truck. Okay, the casket. Also, I have heard family stories about Dory, that Dory he probably would not have been the kind of person that would have been particularly non-racist. He probably would have been about average amount of racist. His father was a Confederate, my great-great-grandfather. But I'll tell you what else about Dory. If somebody said, hey, Dory, go get a gun and let's get on a boat and go try to catch some people, he would have been right there. He would have been, that would have been, not like a volunteer fireman, or a volunteer deputy. If I can wear a gun and a badge and go do stuff like that, yeah, let's go. So but I don't know. I only know the sheriff formed a posse. So that's it. Sheriff got off of the Napa launch, and along with his posse, searched every house in Bogue. Not when I say searched, I mean no Fourth Amendment violations. He knocked on the door, and invariably a child or a woman would come to the door. Where's your husband? Where's your daddy? Where's your brother? He's fishing. That's what he's doing. Or he is, he had to go to New Bern today. Or, I don't know, I hadn't seen him, but he might be back tomorrow. They did find a couple of men who were doing things in Bogue that still had soot on them. What's up with that soot? I was cleaning the stove this morning and a gust of wind. You think I didn't make that up. That's what one of them said. I was cleaning the stove out because it's June. It's time to put the stove in the barn, and a gust of wind blew smoke all over me. So, but they didn't make any arrests, and they did not find Lewis Patrick. So they got back onto the Napa launch and came back to Beaufort again. Switch, please. Meantime, the real crowd had taken him into the woods and began torturing him. They thought that he had accomplices. So we're back to your question. Or maybe it was yours, yeah. But anyhow, they thought that he had accomplices, and they were going to torture him until he gave who the accomplices were. So they would hang him up by his thumbs in a tree, no kidding, and drop him. And then they would hang him by his neck until he almost passed out and drop him. And then tell us who your accomplice is. They did this all day, all day. He finally confessed, okay? Switch, please. That is word for word his quote unquote confession. Now, let me tell you how we got that. Several days after all of this is over, the newspaper reporter for the News and Observer goes to Bogue and interviews. Can anybody guess who they interviewed? Dr. J.W. Sanders. And J.W. Sanders says, guess what? It just turns out that one of the real kidnappers, not me, one of the real kidnappers brought me this yesterday, and it's a transcription of this guy Patrick's confession. And here it is, printed in the newspaper. And so the reporter says, dang, thank you, sir. And he runs back to Raleigh, or types it up or whatever, and it appears in the next day News and Observer. That is the confession. That man right there would no more allow me to introduce that crap in a jury trial than, there is no way he would. And then during the break, he'd ream my butt for trying. You can look at that and see that nobody of Lewis Patrick's, the way he would have spoken, the words he would have used, nobody would have spoken like that. Further, we don't even know who transcribed it. when it was done, what were the circumstances. And then if you hang somebody up by their thumbs, you can get them to say anything, anything. So no, but guess what the people of North Carolina did? They read it in the newspaper and said, well, dang, it's in the newspaper, must be right. Okay, well, yep, that's right. Yes, ma'am.
I love this sentence right here in the first paragraph. He then directed me to go to a dairy where we drank some milk.
Guess who owned the dairy? Guess who owned the dairy? Dr. J.W. Sanders owned the dairy. He found some milk gone the day after the murder, and since we're going to accuse Patrick of murdering Weeks, we'll go ahead and accuse him of stealing my daggone milk too. So yes, J.W. Sanders owned the dairy. So he put that in there as well. So yeah, but if you read that, you know good and well that that is absolutely fabricated. No one would believe that. And not even in 1899 do I think a judge would allow that into a trial. Talk about rank hearsay. I mean, that is hearsay upon hearsay upon hearsay. And so, anyhow, but that's supposedly his confession. Okay. If you would, please. The 15th. Getting down to the brass tacks now. They tortured Weeks. That's good right there. Thank you, Doc. They tortured Weeks all day long, and it was on the 14th. Finally quit, By the way, in the confession, he inculpated Frank Stiles, the fellow that he lived with, and another fellow named Rufus Penny. Both of those guys had alibis, and so they didn't do it. So he did it alone, if he did it at all. Okay, so anyhow, on the 15th in the early morning hours, now this is June the 15th, everybody in Bogue's windows are open. It's in the middle of the night. Don't even know exactly what time, but after midnight. Back of what is now the Spring Garden, we got one in New Bern too, Spring Garden Baptist Church on the Bogue Luke Road, they tied him to a fence post. Lewis Patrick, switch if you would please, and using guns that look a lot like this, left over from the Civil War, some more modern guns, everybody had one, and shotguns too. Switch please. They shot him 75 times. Well, they think, about 75 times. And left him hanging right by the fence in a little place that's now called Patrick's Hill. It's a rise. Bogue is very flat, but there's some rises, some hills. And there's back of that church, next to a field in those days, it's now wooded over, there's a rise that's called Patrick's Hill, because that's where this guy was lynched. And they left him there for a day and a half in the hot June sun. They just walked around him. Didn't call the sheriff, didn't call anybody, just left him hanging there. Everybody in Bogue heard the shots because their windows were open in the middle of the night. Imagine on a still June hot night, some people start shooting 75 times in your community. They all woke up, everybody knew what it was, so they went back to sleep. And I like to think that off in the distance, as the sound rolled across the sound, Bogue sound, that you could hear a dog barking maybe or something. But nobody got up to investigate, or at least no reports of it. They left him there for 2 days. Finally, neighbors in the area said, look, this guy is rotting out here. Can y'all do something? And J.W. Sanders hires 2 guys to go and get the body off of the fence and buries it in a slave cemetery on the Sanders property. If you would change. All of this was in the newspapers after it happened, obviously. Died in a rain of bullets. That's true. That's exactly right what happened. It says he was hidden on an island. For years they thought that was what happened. They thought he was hidden on Dog Island, which doesn't exist anymore. It's an island between the Bogue banks and the mainland. And it's been washed over now enough that it doesn't exist anymore. You can still see it on some of the charts though. But he wasn't. He was actually on the mainland in the woods behind Bogue. Okay, switch if you would please. I didn't know where to put this. I'm not through yet. But this was in the New Bern newspaper. And whatever person, whatever editor wrote that, hit the dang nail directly on the head. I've written the story up. My story's about 7,000 words. It's going to be in my first book that I publish. And I'm including this because this, to me, sums up everything. And it was written, on the 20th of June, or I published at least, in the 20th of June, 1899. Now, it probably was written before then because apparently the author didn't know for sure whether or not Patrick was dead. But he was. But doggone if that Newbern editor didn't hit the nail on the head with that. So, okay, switch if you would, please. The 16th of June. Got ahead of myself a little bit. Patrick's now buried in the unknown grave. We don't know where it was. We know it was on the Sanders property, but we don't know where on the Sanders property. If you'd switch, please. Arriving on that day in the afternoon is Coroner Norcom from the Norcoms in Beaufort. He is down because he's heard word through the grapevine that Lewis Patrick was shot. He comes down, asks people in Bogue, do y'all have a lynching? Well, they shot that black guy. Well, when did that happen? Well, it happened day before yesterday. Well, where is he? I'd like to do an inquest. Well, he was stinking pretty bad, so we buried him. Do y'all want us to dig him up? And Norcom said, no. And so they had an inquest in one of the stores down there, and they came to a conclusion. Y'all remember Captain Obvious? Okay. The conclusion was, if you'd switch, that Lewis Patrick came to his death from pistol shots fired by parties unknown to the jury. Okay. Well, we figured that. And that ended it. They got back into their vehicle, whatever it was, boat, horse buggy, whatever, went back to Beaufort. Now, if you'd switch one more time. Years later, there was a ghost story about Patrick's Hill that there's bound to be a ghost story about something like this, that for years people wouldn't go there at night because of the shrieks and the howls and what have you. Jackie and I went there, but we went there in broad daylight, took the picture. But yeah, so anyhow, switch if you would, please. Aftermath. The first thing that happened, switch please, was that everybody in Bogue started carrying guns. It was like the Wild West. And so at some point, not long after this murder, there was a woman, Dora Taylor, no, I'm sorry, that was the victim. There was George Taylor's wife who owned a store. In those days, I think you were either a Taylor or you were a Weeks in Bogue. But apparently she was carrying a gun that she had never been trained how to use or didn't know how to use. And this young lady comes into the store that she was attending. She says, would you like to look at my gun I got? And the young lady says, well, sure. And so Miss Taylor is handing the gun to the young lady, and the gun predictably goes off and kills the young lady. Okay? That's sort of just a sideline to what happened. That happened in August after June, I think. Okay, if you would, please. The next thing is happier. There was a congressman in the U.S. Congress, George H. White, who was from Duplin County originally. He ran from there and got into the North Carolina legislature, served terms, was very successful, moved to Tarboro, well, and to Craven too, and then moved to Tarboro to launch a bid for U.S. Congress and won. Okay, he was a black man in Congress, I think the last one after Reconstruction to be in Congress, and he introduced the very first anti-lynching statute, and it, of course, didn't pass. But, he introduced it at least. Remember, I told you before that if somebody actually decided to prosecute a lyncher, you would charge them with just plain old murder. It wasn't anything particular, it was just a murder, okay? But he introduced an anti-lynching statute, and it was defeated. Go again, please. Until last year. President Biden signed in the first federal anti-lynching statute. It's called the Emmett Till bill, but it's essentially the same thing as Mr. White, the black congressman from Tarboro, introduced in or maybe 1900. It was on the strength, or not the strength, it was because that congressman had seen what happened in Wilmington with the insurrection and saw or read about what happened to this lynching down in Bogue that he introduced that bill. So it reverberates to this day. Okay, switch again. And now for the epilogue that you all are not going to believe. This is where I come in. August 1935, sheriff, he's like 2 sheriffs later now, Elmer Chadwick. I think he was from Straits. But Sheriff Elmer was sitting at his desk and the morning mail comes in. And here's a letter from Cortez, Florida. And in that letter is a confession by A.F. Taylor, who I think was the elder son of Miss Taylor, the Borden lady. Not Leon, the guy, but the elder brother that helped go into the building. Sheriff, dear sir, he says that he's a Christian and that he knows that he's going to die soon, or feels like it, and that he knows the ways of the Lord now but didn't back in 1899, and he knows that Jesus tells him that he has to confess his sins, and he says, I want to confess that I was one of the lynchers. And importantly, he says, our doctor was one of the ringleaders. Imagine that. And so he says, I'll come to Beaufort if you want me to. I understand, but please write me back and tell me what to do. I confess. I did it. I had a gun in it. Mm-hmm. A gun. Mm-hmm. When you have a gun in something, that means you're as guilty as everybody else, even though you don't pull the trigger. All right? And so he signs it and carries it to the district attorney, who was not David McFadden. That was later on. But he carries it to the district attorney in 1935, and the district attorney looks at it and rightfully says, we're probably not going to prosecute. To begin with, the only person we've got to prosecute is this guy in Florida. Secondly, in North Carolina, you can't prosecute somebody based only on their confession. And that's absolutely right. And then, believe it or not, and the third thing is we're just not going to open that can of worms again. And I have to admit that if I was the elected district attorney, I probably in those days would have come to the same conclusion. I would, however, have sent an investigator to Florida to at least get a full statement so that we could have solved it and put it out of the books.
There might have been some other.
Right, exactly. So I would have done that, but I don't think I would have prosecuted the case, especially, I mean, there's just something inherently wrong with him confessing, and then you prosecuting him as the only person. So,
Yeah.
all right, so anyhow.
Taking the whole.
All right, and with that, the final switcheroo, thank you.